Well, good afternoon. We trust that you had a good weekend, and I'm excited this week to transition from the story of Joshua and the law of influence to Joseph and the law of process. As I mentioned last Friday, our biblical foundation for this week, week 3, is completely from the book of Genesis, chapter 37, verses 1 through 36. Genesis 39 through 42, verse 6, so a little over 3 chapters there. And then Genesis 47, 13 through 26. So that accounts primarily for the life of Joseph, which will be a very fascinating study for us this week. So the law of process. Leadership develops daily, not in a day. That simply means that it's not something like wealth, let's say, that happens all at once, but that it takes a lifetime, a long, long time to develop. And so we want to be aware that our dream, kind of like leadership, in fact, this is our thought for the day today. It's not the dream of a lifetime, it's the dream that takes a lifetime. Let me read that again so that it sticks out in our mind for our leadership thought for today. It's not the dream of a lifetime, it's the dream that takes a lifetime. So we're going to talk this week about the story of Joseph. You know the story, Joseph and his brothers. His brothers didn't exactly like him one bit because his father Jacob favored him over the others, and Jacob gave Joseph the coat of many colors, and that infuriated his other brothers even more. And so we're going to kind of get into the story today and throughout the week. But to get our minds wrapped around our subject about the law of process, leadership happens daily, not in a day. I want to talk just a little bit about leadership and vision to open our time today and really for this week. John Maxwell writes in the 21 Most Powerful Minutes in a Leader's Day on page 37, all great leaders have a dream, a vision of a better future. When vision is shared in the right way, it can enhance a person's leadership. But when it's done in the wrong way, it creates problems. And that, of course, is what got Joseph into trouble. Like most great leaders, Joseph had a vision long before he had the leadership ability to make it happen. He had a divine leadership destiny, but he didn't start out as an effective leader. He had no influence with his brothers. So there are some prerequisites for God to use anybody, and this really applies to Joseph as well. Because God had to prepare Joseph for the great leadership responsibility he would eventually undertake. And this process of preparation includes the following. We'll touch on this real quickly, and then we'll dive a little bit more deeply into each of these 3 items. 1 is time to mature. 2nd is trials to strengthen. 3rd is God to bless. So this was the preparation process. And I might say that God used this process not just with Joseph, but many biblical leaders. When you take time and study people like Peter, people like Paul in the New Testament, Joseph in the Old Testament, David, who we looked at in week 1, all of them experienced a very significant time gap between the time that they were called and the time that they actually began to walk that out. And so keep that in mind as we talk about Joseph this week. So if you remember from the story, Joseph was 17 years old when he began to have his dreams, and also when his brothers sold him into slavery. Now, I don't know if you caught it as you read further into Genesis, but it says in around chapter 39, I believe, how old he was when he stood before Pharaoh. It says that he was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, and then really began to enter into what God had prepared him for. So you math scholars out there can quickly ascertain that that is 13 years of that intervened. So what did God do during those 13 years of preparation? You know, for us today, that seems like an awfully long time. To stop and think about just the length of time, let alone what happened to Joseph during those 13 years. God used those years to change, humble, and prepared Joseph for his role. When he was ready, Joseph became a great leader. But think about the Joseph before he was sold into slavery. It was obvious that he was the favorite of his father Jacob, and it certainly seems like he did not mind letting his brothers in on that not so secret, and that he didn't really taunt them per se, but he certainly let them know that he was aware that he was his father's favorite. So you can imagine when they already were predisposed to not care for him so much, what their reaction might have been. And again, remember, he was the youngest one at this time, that he had this dream that they were all going to bow down to him. Then he had another one that included his father and mother. So you can kind of tell that Joseph was maybe a little full of himself, and needed some preparation time, much like many of us when we are first called and when we first enter into a leadership role. So God used that time, as I said, to change and humble and prepare Joseph for this role. In addition to this time to mature, Joseph also went through some pretty significant trials. Think about gold for just a minute. How is gold purified? Of course, it must pass through the fire. In the same way, leaders are purified when they pass through trials. Consider Joseph's trials. First, he was betrayed by his brothers. Well, actually, they wanted to kill him first, but because of Reuben, his oldest brother's intervention, he ended up being sold. Actually, Judah sold him, was responsible for that. Reuben wanted to rescue him. But be that as it may, he ends up being sold by his brothers to Ishmaelites who were on their way to Egypt. So he becomes a slave in the house of Potiphar. And then, as you remember the story, Potiphar's wife took a fancy to him, so to speak, and wanted to have sexual relations with him. Joseph, being the honorable man that he was, of course, ran away from that, quite literally in this case. But as he was running away from this temptation, he left his outer garment, which then Potiphar's wife used to falsely accuse Joseph of making advances on her, when in fact it was the other way around. So what happened? Joseph ended up in prison due to a false accusation. So think a little bit with me. If you're Joseph, you've been called by God to do something great. You know it's going to result in having a lot of authority. And right after that, first you become a slave. And if that's not bad enough, then you become a prisoner for something you didn't do. Do you think that might have raised a question or two in Joseph's mind, in his heart? But you see, these trials, rather than impeding his preparation for fulfilling God's call on his life, actually forged that preparation. And then this last and most important consideration in terms of God's maturity process is that God has got to bless it. You see, when it comes to spiritual leadership, we can't accomplish anything of real value without God's empowerment. Jesus was the one who said in John chapter 15 and verse 5, "He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit. For without me, you can do what? Nothing." Nothing. And so God's got to be in it. It's got to be God's idea. It's got to be God's empowerment. It's got to be God's process. And as we submit to that, we will accomplish God's results. And so as we begin to wind down today, God blessed Joseph as he worked in Potiphar's house as a slave. Then he blessed him as he worked in the prison. 4 times in chapter 39 of Genesis, the Bible expresses God's favor on Joseph. For example, in Genesis 39:23, it states, "The Lord was with him, and whatever he did," get this, "the Lord made it prosper." So what's the conclusion for you and I just from this statement? It's simply this: if you are on God's side, you cannot lose. You cannot lose. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have that sense that God is for you and who can be against you? That's according to Romans 8:31. But that the Lord made everything you do prosper. I think in Joseph's case, it has a lot to do with what he was willing to endure in order to hang on to his dream. And so that leads us then to today's question for reflection. It simply says, are you willing to pay the price to accomplish your dream? Sometimes that might be false accusation. Sometimes it might mean unjust treatment. But God can use even those kind of things to accomplish something wonderful, first in us and then through us. And so may all of us be encouraged today as we contemplate what Joseph went through and how he came out on the other side, refined, purified, prepared, and then God used him in a tremendous way. And isn't it interesting that at the end of the day, the dream that Joseph had as a 17-year-old actually did come true? With that, we wish you well and look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 3:30. God bless you all. Thank you.